Assalamu alaikum. We are still in the 5th week, and let me remind you once again that after this and the next week we will have your midterms, and I will be communicating with you on the subject of midterms and how to go ahead with it, the assignments on that. Today we'll talk about the Cold War. The Cold War was the most important political and diplomatic issue of the early post-war period. It grew out of a long-standing disagreement between the Soviet Union and the United States that developed after the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Soviet Communist Party under Lenin considered itself the spearhead of an international movement that would replace the existing political order in the West and the economy of capitalists. And indeed, throughout the world, in 1918, American troops participated in the Allied intervention in Russia on behalf of the anti-Bolshevik forces. An American diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union did not come until 1933. And then during World War II, however, the two countries found themselves allied, and they downplayed their differences to counter the Nazi threat. At the war's end, antagonisms surfaced again. United States hoped to share with other countries its conception of liberty, equality, and democracy. It sought also to learn from the perceived mistakes of the post-World War I era, when American political disengagement and economic protectionism were thought that it has contributed to the rise of dictatorship in Europe and elsewhere. America was again facing a post-war world of civil wars and disintegrating empires. Recalling the specter of General Depression of 1920 to 1940, America now advocated open trade for two reasons. They have learnt it from the Depression experience: to create markets for American agricultural and industrial projects, and the second, to ensure the ability of Western European nations to export as a means of rebuilding their economies. The American policymakers believed that it would promote economic growth at home and abroad, bolstering US friends and allies in the process. The Soviet Union had its own agenda. The Russian historical tradition of centralized autocratic government contrasted with the American emphasis on democracy. Marxist-Leninist ideology had been downplayed during the war, but still guided Soviet policy. Having repelled Hitler's thrust, they were determined to preclude another such attack. They demanded defensible borders and friendly regimes in Eastern Europe, and seemingly equated both with the spread of communism, regardless of the wishes of native populations. However, the United States had declared that one of its war aims was the restoration of independence and self-government to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Then comes the question of that how Harry Truman provided leadership. He was the new chief executive, and he succeeded Roosevelt as president before the end of the war. He was an unpretentious man who had previously served as Democratic senator from Missouri. Then as vice president, Truman initially felt ill-prepared to govern. Still, Truman responded quickly to these new challenges. Sometimes impulsive on small matters, he proved willing to make hard and carefully he considered decisions on large matters. A small sign on his White House desk declared, "The buck stops here." His judgments about how to respond to the Soviet Union ultimately determined the shape of the early Cold War. Let's talk about what were the origins of the Cold War. The Cold War developed as differences about the shape of the post-war world created suspicions and distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. The first and the most difficult test case was Poland, the eastern half of which had been invaded and occupied by the USSR in 1939. Moscow demanded a government subject to Soviet influence. Washington wanted a more independent representative government following the Western model. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 had produced an agreement on Eastern Europe open to different interpretations. It included a promise of free and unfettered elections. When Truman met the foreign minister of Soviet Union, Truman stood firm on Polish self-determination issue, lecturing the Soviet diplomat about the need to implement the Yalta Accord. During the closing months of World War II, Soviet military forces occupied all of Central and Eastern Europe. Moscow used its military power to support the efforts of the communist parties in Eastern Europe and crush the Democrat parties. Communists took over one nation after the another. The process concluded with a shocking coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia in 1948. Somehow it defies the communists' claim that they turn the world over to themselves through peace. Public statements defined the beginning of the Cold War. In 1946, Stalin declared that international peace was impossible under the present capitalist development of the world economy. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a dramatic speech in Fulton, Missouri, with Truman sitting on the platform. From the Staten in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, Churchill said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." Britain and the United States, he declared, had to work together to counter the Soviet Union. And this counter efforts are known as the containment. Containment of the Soviet Union became American policy in the post-war years. A top officer of the US Embassy in Moscow, George Kennan, defined the new approach in the long telegram he sent to the State Department in 1946. He extended his analysis in an article under the signature X in the prestigious journal Foreign Affairs. Pointing to Russia's traditional sense of insecurity, Kennan argued that the Soviet Union would not soften their stance under any circumstances. Moscow's pressure to expand its power had to be stopped through firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. The first significant application of the containment doctrine came in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean and in early 1946, the United States demanded and obtained a full Soviet withdrawal from Iran, the northern half of which it had occupied during the war. That summer, the United States pointedly supported Turkey against Soviet demands for control of the Turkish straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. In early 1947, American policy crystallized when Britain told the United States that it could no longer afford to support the government of Greece against a strong communist insurgency. Critics from the left later charged that to whip up American support for the policy of containment, Truman overstated the Soviet threat to the United States. In turn, His statement spied a wave of hysterical anti-communism through the country. Containment also called for extensive economic aid to assist the recovery of war-torn Europe. With many of the region's nations economically and politically unstable, the United States feared that local communist parties directed by Moscow would capitalize on their wartime record of resistance to the Nazis and come to power. Post-war Germany was a special problem. It had been divided into US, Soviet, British and French zones of occupation, with the former German capital of Berlin itself divided into 4 zones. So American leaders feared by this time that losing Berlin would be a prelude to losing Germany and subsequently all of Europe. So by then, Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and especially the Czech coup had alarmed the Western Europeans. The next year, the United States defined its defense aims clearly. The National Security Council, the forum where the President, cabinet officers and other executive branch members considered national security and foreign affairs issues, undertook a full-fledged review of American foreign and defense policy. And based on the assumptions of this policy, that the Soviet Union was engaged in a fanatical effort to seize control of all governments wherever possible. After the start of the Korean War, a reluctant Truman approved the document. The United States proceeded to increase defense spending dramatically. And then the Cold War in Asia and in Middle East spread over. Cold War struggles also occurred in the Middle East and the Asia, and the risks were very high. The region's strategic importance as a supplier of oil had provided much of the impetus for pushing Soviet out of Iran in 1946. But the United States officially recognized the new state of Israel 15 minutes after it was proclaimed, a decision Truman made over strong resistance from Marshall and the State Department. The result was an enduring dilemma how to maintain ties with Israel while keeping good relations with bitterly anti-Israel and oil-rich Arab states. The Eisenhower years as president and how they dealt with Cold War was that he was a war hero rather than a career politician. He had a natural common touch that made him widely popular. But despite all these skills, he shared Truman's basic view of American foreign policy. He also perceived communism as a monolithic force struggling for the world supremacy. The new president and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had argued that containment did not go far enough to stop Soviet expansion. The situation at home about this Cold War thing was that McCarthyism, as we know today in American history, the most vigorous anti-communist warrior was Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, and he gained power when the Republican Party won control of the Senate in 1952. McCarthy overstepped himself by challenging the US Army when one of the assistants was drafted. And relying on extensive press and television coverage, he continued to search for treachery among second-level officials in the Eisenhower administration. So McCarthy, in many ways, represented the worst domestic excesses of the Cold War. As Americans repudiated him, it became natural for many to assume that the communist threat at home and abroad has been grossly overblown. Thank you.